Israel and Iran are at war right now, and the outcome will change the face of the Middle East for decades to come. Not only has Israel more or less demolished the foundations of the Ayatollah regime within a matter of days, they've opened gaps within global affairs that will force a realignment between Middle Eastern powers and even global powers. We're going to talk about why and how this war began in the first place. We're going to talk about what's happened since it began, and we're going to talk about the presumptive winners and losers of this conflict. We're also going to discuss how those potential winners and losers might adjust their global strategy following the outcome of this war. Editor Caleb here. I recorded this video on Tuesday, June 17th. Of course, by the time this video is published, a lot has happened, so I'm going to be jumping back in at the end of this video with some updates on things that have happened between whenever I recorded this video and whenever I'm going to be publishing this video. So stay tuned at the end of this video for some updates on that. Ever since Iran's 1979 Islamic Revolution, the relationship between Tehran and Tel Aviv has been a rocky one. Iran went from being run by the Shah, which was a US-backed monarch, to a sworn enemy of both Israel and the United States. That shift led to what has basically been a Cold War between Iran and Israel, with proxy conflicts carried out between proxy groups, covert operations, cyber attacks, and a fair bit of international espionage. Fast forward, however, to October 7th, 2023, the day that Hamas launched their surprise attack on Israel, and you see that Iran did not pull any punches following its support. From then on, the proxy war intensified between Israel and Iran, and it became clear that the region was entering a whole new direction with a new level of direct confrontation. This is all something that I talked about in past videos, especially around the time of the attacks. I said at the time that there was a significant risk that conflict, the war in Gaza, could become a larger regional war. But it's all gone differently from how I originally thought, and we're going to talk about that in a moment. Shortly after October 7th, Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is one of their largest proxy groups within their axis of resistance, opened fire on northern Israel. Over 4,400 exchanges and rocket fire followed, pushing tens of thousands of Israelis to evacuate from northern Israel. It was the most overt clash between the Iranian-backed force and Israel since 2006, whenever Israel and Hezbollah went to war previously. Then, of course, came April of 2024, which led to direct strikes between Israel and Iran. Israel bombed an Iranian consulate in Damascus, killing 2 IRGC generals. Iran responded a week later with Operation True Promise, with over 300 drones and missiles fired towards Israeli territory, though most of them were intercepted. Israel struck back on April 19th, targeting a radar site in Isfahan, Iran, but that really just sent a message to Iran that Israel could continue to strike, but really both chose to de-escalate from there on. The two would go at it again in October of 2024 after Israel assassinated the Hamas political leader Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran. Iran launched Operation True Promise 2, launching over 200 ballistic missiles at Israel. Israel's Nevatim airbase took several hits, as well as several other government, intelligence, and military sites having been targeted, though most of these missiles were intercepted as well. This is a solid preview to the kind of fighting that we're seeing right now. After this, Israel responded with more strikes of their own. However, these were all weeks apart from each other, and that is important to note because it allowed both Israel and Iran to really carefully calibrate their attacks to allow room for de-escalation. And that is exactly what happened. Meanwhile, and following these events, concern over Iran's nuclear program continued to intensify. By early 2025, uranium enrichment levels were higher than ever, bringing Iran closer and closer to a potential nuclear breakout, something that the International Atomic Energy Agency flagged as non-compliant for the first time in 2 decades. Around the same time, the U.S. was trying to revive a diplomatic agreement between the U.S. and Iran, hosting talks in Oman and Rome and other places as well. Iran insisted that it would not dial back its enrichment, which made this entire process even more difficult. However, at the same time, Israel was not just watching, it was preparing. Classified U.S. documents leaked details about IDF rehearsals, strike packages, and drone routes all aimed at Iran. It was pretty clear to anybody watching the situation play out that Israel was preparing to take matters into their own hands if they felt that Iran wasn't willing to reach a negotiation agreement, or if they felt that whatever agreement came out of these talks was insufficient for what they wanted. And it was pretty clear that what Israel wanted was a complete dismantlement of Iran's nuclear program. At the beginning of the talks, Trump gave Iran a 60-day window to reach a deal. However, on the 61st day, Israel struck. In early June of this year, Israel launched Operation Rising Lion, which included airstrikes targeting everything from nuclear sites to military sites and air defense sites all across Iran. Netanyahu himself justified this operation as necessary to stop Iran's nuclear program. Iran began Operation True Promise 3 in response, making it a trilogy, launching missiles at Israel. In the early hours of June 13th, Israel launched Operation Rising Lion, which combined covert Mossad actions with airstrikes from the Israeli Air Force of the IEF. Mossad had quietly set up a drone base within Iran, quietly smuggling in drones via containers and trucks right next to Iranian air defense sites. These small explosive drones, which were similar in nature to Ukraine's Operation Spiderweb, hunted air defense radars and missile launch sites, which effectively crippled Iran's early warning capability. I warned that this was going to be a case that we would see again and again in the future in my last video talking about Ukraine's Operation Spiderweb. And it's crazy that we're already seeing this happen so soon. However, at the same time, something like this would have taken months of preparation and planning, so I don't necessarily think that it's likely that Ukraine and Israel really knew what each other were doing. Both likely came to the conclusion on what these drones could do in a clandestine setting and really just executed on that to perfection. Once the air defense systems and radars were out of the way, the IEF deployed around 200 aircraft and began hitting targets all across Iran, with over 100 targets being struck in Iran's west, including near Tehran, Natanz, and Isfahan. Within 24 hours, Israel had achieved air superiority in the country, giving pilots virtually complete freedom to operate deep inside of Iran. And these were not just random attacks too. Israel specifically was targeting key leaders within Iran's top military leadership, targeting not just the IRGC commanders, but nuclear scientists as well. This list, at least so far, has included the IRGC chief Hossein Salami, Army Forces Chief Mohammad Bagheri, which is equivalent to the U.S. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Commander Gholam al-Rashid, Aerospace Commander Amir Ali Hajizadeh, Intelligence Chief Mohammad Kazemi, plus his deputy Hassan Mohakik, as well as at least 6 nuclear scientists so far, including Feridun Abbasi Davani, Mohammad Mekhi Taranchi, and others. This decapitation campaign struck at Iran's military and scientific backbone, aiming to degrade both strategic leadership and nuclear progress. At the same time, Israeli jets pummeled nuclear facilities and energy infrastructure. At Natanz, Israel struck the above-ground pilot fuel enrichment plant, which was completely destroyed. In Isfahan, damage to the uranium conversion and production facilities took place. In Iraq, the heavy water reactor was hit. In Fordow, Israel has continued to strike with minor damage reported, but that's largely because a lot of Iran's infrastructure in Fordow is built inside of a mountain. So they need deep penetrating bombs that really only the United States has, but we'll get to that point in a moment. Israel has also struck all kinds of political sites, as well as the headquarters for Iran's intelligence services and their key propaganda outlet. And that's all just happening by the time of this recording, which is Tuesday, June 17th. So by the time you're watching this, there will likely have been way more strikes. Israel also reports that they've struck about half of Iran's mobile launch sites. In short, Israeli strikes have completely degraded Iran's nuclear trajectory and military command structure. At the same time, the U.S. is saying that it has not participated in these strikes, but the reality feels a little bit more complicated. The Pentagon said that they had no involvement in any offensive strikes, and the Trump administration has praised the operation, but said that they were really only involved in the defense of Israel, so intercepting Iranian missiles. Israel, however, has been pushing this entire time for more involvement from Washington, hoping that the U.S. will join in offensive operations. And this leads to the massive airlift of dozens of combat aircraft and air refuelers that have gone from the continental United States towards the CENTCOM AOR, as well as the movement of the USS Nimitz. And all of this is designed, at least publicly, to give President Trump more options. The movement of the USS Nimitz is important because it's moving from the Indo-PACOM AOR to the CENTCOM AOR. And if you're not familiar with that, that's basically moving it from the Pacific to the Indian Ocean. We're going to hit more on why that is very specifically important soon. It's interesting also to note that the Nimitz is a very old aircraft carrier. It's slated to be retired next year, but one of its earlier operations was in 1980 to help rescue U.S. hostages held in Iran. That operation was a complete failure, but it's interesting to see the Nimitz kind of wrap up its deployment, its final deployment against a very old foe. Iran has not necessarily taken all this lying down, but for the most part, they've just been getting dog-walked this entire time. Iran began by launching gradual but increasingly intense missile barrages at Israel. These started with really just a few dozen projectiles, but swiftly escalated within days to over 350 missiles, with hundreds of drones all launched under Operation True Promise 3. However, Israel's multi-layered defense system, which includes the Iron Dome, David's Sling, and Arrow, which all consecutively handle increasingly more strategic missile systems, as well as U.S.-supplied Patriot and THAAD batteries, have been able to perform very well. For the first 24 hours, David's Sling intercepted around 90% of the incoming threats. But as the volume of missiles has surged, the interceptor rates have begun to dwindle. The success rate has dropped by 5 to 10% as missiles have begun to slip through, which is expected. Iran has been known to have a very large quantity of missiles and ability to launch these missiles, and the real question has been whether or not Israel had enough interceptors to match. And so Iran's strategy has been to overwhelm the interception capability and to really target whatever they can hit. And these breaches saw missiles hit residential areas, which have absolutely wreaked havoc. Iran was also able to strike the Haifa oil refinery, which is one of Israel's 2 oil refineries, shutting down operations. The Israeli Air Force has continued to fly over Iran, trying to slow down Iran's rate of attacks. And last night, on the 16th, it appeared that Iran's attacks have significantly been curbed. Iran pledged to launch the most devastating series of attacks on Israel yet, and really all that was launched was a couple dozen missiles in total, none of which hit Israel. Israel has continued to strike mobile stock. Israel has continued, however, to strike missile stockpiles and mobile launchers within Iran, but the deeper underground silos and storage facilities have proven very tough to crack. Iran has stored and manufactured missiles in deep underground tunnels and will only move them above ground to launch them. Tracking these on-the-move systems has become basically a cat and mouse game, where Israel needs a significant amount of surveillance to be able to track when these launchers are moving onto the surface and preparing to launch, and hopefully they have assets in the area to be able to prosecute those targets before they launch. And like I said before, Israel, at least at the time of this recording, claims that they've already destroyed half of Iran's mobile launch systems. There's also reporting that Israel had tried but was vetoed by the US to target the Ayatollahs specifically in a major strike. Israel has denied these reports, but they have said since that if they were to target the Ayatollah, it would end the war. Despite Iran's public stance of no negotiations under attack, several media outlets like the Wall Street Journal have reported that Tehran is really desperately attempting to signal to the US and therefore to Israel that they want to renegotiate. However, the same report includes information that Iran is still unwilling to budge from nuclear enrichment, so that probably kills any kind of attempt to reach a ceasefire. At the same time, Israel has all the momentum. There's really not much of a reason for Israel to reach a ceasefire because they are in complete control of the situation. Israel says that they aren't really wanting to topple the regime, but what we have seen from these strikes is that they are functionally destroying the regime and setting the conditions for the regime to be toppled anyway. And there's nothing that Iran can really do to stop Israel. All they can do is launch missiles, and the more that they launch, the more Israel destroys the mobile launch sites, and the longer Iran waits, the more of a chance that the US joins into this conflict and potentially inflicts even greater damage onto Iran. Time is on Israel's side, and Israel doesn't even need a lot of time to win anyway. Even if the war were to end today, it has already left Iran significantly weakened both militarily and economically. The leadership of the IRGC, which is essentially the backbone of Iran's regime, which is essentially the backbone of Iran's strategy against Israel and the core pillar of the Iranian regime, has been severely depleted. With most senior leaderships of the IRGC already killed or incapacitated, Iran faces a very critical leadership vacuum at a very critical moment. The IRGC wasn't just a military entity, it was an integral part of Iran's political and economic structure. Losing them is not just about losing good commanders, it's about losing the people who held the regime together. Iran's nuclear ambitions have also been pushed back by decades. Major nuclear sites like Natanz, Fordow, and Iraq have been severely damaged, some even completely destroyed. Israel has also killed key nuclear scientists and destroyed key research facilities, and that means that it's not just a question about rebuilding infrastructure. Iran will need to rebuild the expertise that it had, and this will likely take a whole generation. This damage extends beyond military and nuclear facilities. Critical energy infrastructure, oil refineries, gas plants, and even the energy grid has been very hard hit. For Iran, the economy is overwhelmingly reliant on oil and gas exports. These strikes mean that lifeline is being cut. Iran was already struggling under economic sanctions and internal protests, which also sparked because of poor economic conditions and political repression. These strikes could push the country into a severe economic depression whenever the hostilities do ultimately end. Israel publicly insists again that they're not pursuing regime change, but crippling Iran's economy in this manner is creating conditions that will lead to exactly that. Even without Israel directly forcing political change in Iran, economic collapse often leads to major political upheavals, and that is exactly what Tehran fears the most. Once the bombs stop falling, even if the regime is still there, it won't be long until the people themselves in Iran do rise up and take advantage of the new fragility found within the Iranian regime, and in protest of how the regime has managed the country. I think the most striking and telling feature of this war is how Iran has largely fought this war alone. The Axis of Resistance, which is Iran's network of proxy groups across the Middle East that includes Hezbollah and various militias in Iraq, as well as Hamas in Gaza and the Houthis in Yemen, have all barely participated at all. Hezbollah has already fought and been exhausted in a war with Israel last year, and they have been completely sidelined in this conflict. The Iraqi groups thus far have chosen not to get involved directly, though there's some reporting that they are considering joining together as a coalition against the United States if the US joins. And the Houthis have continued strikes on Israel, but in very limited capacity. And like I said, I've spoken in past videos, especially early in the war in Gaza, about what a regional war might potentially look like between Israel and Iran, and my expectation was that Iran and the Axis of Resistance would work in tandem to make Israel's life basically a very difficult situation. That is not at all what has happened. The war has revealed a very uncomfortable truth to Iran, that the Axis of Resistance was not as united a front as it originally appeared to be. Instead of joining forces in solidarity, each faction has effectively gone their own way and has left Iran effectively isolated. Iran, which again expected unified support, has faced the overwhelming power of Israel's air force, and it has done so alone, and this is a battle that they just cannot be expected to win. This was, again, for Iran, supposed to be a group effort, a group project. Instead, Israel was able to isolate and effectively 1v1 Hezbollah and knock them out fairly quickly. Syria collapsed because the people hated Assad. The Iraq groups are honestly a bit of a head scratcher why they've sidelined themselves, but I would kind of continue to keep an eye on them, especially if the US doesn't get involved. And the Houthis are the Houthis. I mean, credit to them. They've kind of stayed loyal to the cause this whole time, but their capability of actually striking Israel is not that significant, especially whenever Iran's ability to support them is not that robust, at least right now. In short, the Middle East after this war will be fundamentally different. With its nuclear capabilities crippled and the military leadership decimated, Iran now primarily poses an unconventional threat rather than a direct military threat to Israel. Think sabotage, cyber attacks, maybe even terrorism. This is all dangerous, yes, but it's far more manageable for Israel and the United States than dealing with a larger, robust conventional threat or even a nuclear threat. Handling asymmetric threats feels less existential than facing a nuclear-capable adversary with a ballistic missile magazine that's very deep and capable of reaching your homeland. Without Iran, Hezbollah in Lebanon, similar groups in Syria and Iraq and in Yemen are stranded. Hezbollah, which has historically been a very powerful and well-armed group, now faces the grim reality of basically no funding coming from Iran, diminished weapon supplies, and a shrinking regional influence. And this has already become reality following the fall of Assad and the severing of that logistics link. Hezbollah's key conventional capabilities have relied heavily on Iranian backing, which for the foreseeable future will be drastically reduced or outright non-existent. The Houthis in Yemen are in a very similar position. Their missile and drone strikes against Saudi Arabia, ships in the Red Sea, and against Israel have all been sustained by Iranian technical expertise, parts, and resources. Without steady Iranian support, it's unclear how long the Houthis can continue to pose a significant threat to the region. Their ability to wage war or even just maintain control inside of Yemen might also decline very rapidly, very fast. And this shifts the balance of power within Yemen itself and allows the potential for other groups within Yemen or the original government to challenge the Houthis' authority. As for Hamas in Gaza, their survival really already hangs by a thread. They've already been heavily depleted by years of fighting Israel, and now effectively being cut off from Iranian support, Hamas faces the genuine risk of total collapse. Israel's campaign against Hamas has been completely brutal and comprehensive, but without Iran's backing, Hamas's outlook looks increasingly bleak. We're going to talk about winners and losers more in depth here in just a moment, but I want to talk here about the United States real quick. One of America's key regional adversaries within the Middle East, that is Iran, who is themselves responsible for the deaths of thousands of American soldiers in Iraq, as well as the targeting of U.S. troops all across the Middle East for decades, is being neutralized without major U.S. intervention so far. This may ultimately require some U.S. intervention, but certainly not in the kind of comprehensive, boots-on-the-ground type of intervention, hopefully, that Iraq required. This is a strategic windfall for the United States, freeing up diplomatic and military resources that the U.S. can deploy elsewhere, particularly in confronting China. Without Iran to distract the U.S., American policymakers can focus their energy more on the Pacific. This also opens the door, at least theoretically, for more robust support for Ukraine, as a lot of the assets that had been going to Ukraine were instead going to Israel. With fewer distractions in the Middle East, the U.S. might find additional resources to bolster Ukraine's fight against Russia, including defensive supplies like Patriot interceptors. Though admittedly, that's probably more wishful thinking on my part than political reality here in the U.S. But knock on wood, that's what we'll see. In essence, the Israeli operation has completely reshaped the face of the Middle East and has relieved a significant burden on the United States. It has also left Israel's primary foes effectively neutralized. And while the region will remain volatile for years to come, the strategic calculus has unquestionably shifted in Israel and the United States' favor. Of course, all of this takes us to some potential winners and losers of this conflict. But before we do all that, there's a word from today's video sponsor, and that's me. I'm launching a Patreon to support this channel. This will help me to pay for video editing and other key capabilities that help me to grow the quality of these videos and potentially one day the quantity of these videos. And because of that, I'm not going to ask for donations here. And yes, I do have a Buy Me a Coffee if that's interesting to you. I don't market that because I would rather just provide some sort of additional service in return for your support. And that's all in addition to the free YouTube content that I'm making here right now. This, of course, takes me to the Patreon, where my members will receive weekly intelligence reports made by me on the top 5 international stories from the previous week. The analyst tier will receive this report, as well as receiving access to my videos early and weekly recognition at the end of every video. The senior analyst tier will receive all of those benefits, and they will also receive a monthly priority topic request that will be covered in greater depth in the following weekly report. So if you are somebody that's planning to travel somewhere and you want to know about the security situation in that place, or you have a business interest somewhere, or you're just curious about something, you can pop that question or that topic request into the membership. I'll do some research on it and I will present it in the next report for the group. I'll probably be adding more features to this in the future as we move along, but this is what I'm starting with right now. New analyst members will receive their first 7 days for free, so you can kind of see what we've got going so far and see if this is something that you're interested in before you actually commit. Check the link to the Patreon down in the video description for more. With all that, back to the video. It won't surprise anybody whenever I say that Israel has emerged a clear and obvious winner. After years of fighting scattered, bloody conflicts with Iranian proxies, from Hamas in Gaza to Hezbollah in Lebanon to the Houthis in Yemen to militias across Syria and Iraq, Israel has finally struck a very decisive blow across the entire network. They have eliminated a direct, potentially nuclear threat against their country and degraded Iran's ability to wage a conventional war. They have also significantly weakened or outright neutralized multiple proxy groups within Iran's axis of resistance. When this war is over, Israel will be safer than it has been for decades. They fought hard for 2 years, suffering losses and absorbing some absolutely valid criticism over their handling of particularly the war in Gaza, but there's finally a light at the end of the tunnel. They did not handle this whole conflict, specifically Gaza again, particularly well, but when it came to fighting Hezbollah and Iran, they showed just how lethal and precise they can be. Again, contrasting with Gaza, where they were not that precise. That is why they should be criticized, again, for Gaza. They are precise and elite whenever they want to be, and they have been exactly that against Iran. Their Gaza policy will create more problems for them in the future, but that's a different topic. On the flip side, Iran is clearly and undeniably this war's biggest loser. Imagine losing virtually your entire military and nuclear leadership, key scientists, the strategic assets, all within days. Worse yet, Iran has suffered catastrophic losses at essentially no cost to Israel. Tehran's so-called allies within the axis of resistance have mostly sat this whole thing out. Hezbollah, the Iraqi militias, and the Houthis all chose caution over solidarity with their primary backer. For Tehran, this is a very painful lesson in isolation and the risks of relying on proxies for their defense. Adding insult to injury, Iran's recent diplomatic partnership with Russia has collapsed spectacularly. That agreement, which was a promise by Moscow for security cooperation, turned out to be worthless when it mattered the most. Tehran has effectively now become the latest victim of what I'm now dubbing as Russia's diplomatic gotcha game. Meanwhile, I think Saudi Arabia emerges quietly but decisively stronger from this whole ordeal. With Iran effectively sidelined, the Saudis can breathe easier. Their primary regional rival has been neutralized, who have long been supported by Tehran and have targeted Saudi infrastructure, have now been severely weakened. Additionally, the urgency of Saudi Arabia to develop its own nuclear deterrent eases significantly, at least for the immediate future. For Riyadh, this conflict could not have ended that much better. And then, of course, there's Turkey and, by extension, Azerbaijan. Turkey, which historically views Iran with caution, gains a strategic advantage here. Iran has supported Armenia over Azerbaijan, and Tehran has backed several groups opposing Turkish interests in Syria. Now these Iranian-backed initiatives have been severely disrupted. And this is excellent news for Azerbaijan. While Iran's conventional military forces remain very operational to this day, its missile capability and air defense systems have been severely diminished. And this opens the door again for Azerbaijan to insert itself into a more bold strategy against Armenia. Azerbaijan and Turkey might find themselves on more equal footing militarily with Iran, or in the case of Turkey, just superior footing to Iran, which was really unimaginable just months ago. At first glance to this whole situation, you would assume that Russia has lost big, especially considering just how close Russia and Iran have become over the past couple of years. But surprisingly, I would argue Russia is a quiet winner in this whole conflict. First, Russia has already onshored and domesticated a lot of their Shahed drone manufacturing. That means that Iranian supply of these drones doesn't really impact Russia's ability to wage their war in Ukraine. It is true that Russia will not be receiving large shipments of Iranian ballistic missiles anytime soon, but Russia has already ramped up its own domestic production and can still turn to other partners like North Korea. So despite appearances, the direct impact on Russia's military capabilities in Ukraine are not that significant considering the collapse of the Iranian regime. The bigger story here, though, and this is what I think really makes Russia a bit of a winner in this conflict, is the thing that is the true lifeline for the Russian military, and that is its economy and the spike in oil prices that have followed this war. Before this conflict, Russia's economy was already on very shaky ground, propped up almost entirely by revenues from its oil and energy sector. Declining energy prices were a massive red flag for Moscow. Russia really urgently needed higher prices to sustain its costly war in Ukraine and to keep their economy from sliding into an absolute crisis. Iran's oil infrastructure being severely damaged, as well as in Israel, with refineries, storage facilities, and export terminals all being knocked out, is a godsend for Moscow. Iran's oil exports are going to plunge dramatically, which of course naturally drives global energy prices upward. Higher energy prices directly translate to higher revenues for Russia, buying the Kremlin some very desperately needed breathing room. China, for example, which has up to this point at least bought 90% of Iran's oil exports, may now have to turn to Russia to fill the gaps. So while on the surface, Russia seems to have lost a strategic partner, the reality is it's still gaining something significant here. Moscow has quietly but significantly benefited from this whole conflict, buying critical economic stability when it needed it the most. Now let's look a bit further east to China. At first glance, you might think that Beijing has little to do with the war between Israel and Iran, but the reality is a little bit more complex, and interestingly, China stands to gain a lot from this conflict as well. First, consider oil. I already mentioned how China buys roughly 90% of Iranian oil exports before this conflict. With Iranian refineries and export facilities now severely damaged, that oil is about to become a lot more harder and expensive to buy. But China isn't exactly panicking. They're already buying energy with Russia at a very steep discount. So Iran's issues will effectively drive Beijing and Moscow closer to each other, which has already been the trend up to this point anyway. This conflict also creates opportunities for China within Iran itself. itself. With Iranian infrastructure being severely damaged and the economy on the brink, China, which is known for sweeping in with massive infrastructure projects, will likely position itself as a partner with Iran for rebuilding. This is a classic move that China has played across Africa and Central Asia, where they have gained economic and political influence through infrastructure. This is not just sunshine and rainbows for Beijing, though. A very significant downside is Chinese military analysts have now gotten a real-time view of how advanced US-made 5th-generation aircraft like the F-35 perform against air defense and radar systems that are not too dissimilar from China's own systems. For China, this is not just about academic curiosity, it is a very sobering lesson. They're seeing exactly what they're up against if they get into a shooting war with the United States, especially in the Pacific. Now, here is, I think, the most interesting part. If the United States does end up getting pulled into this conflict, and this is kind of already the trend with the Nimitz moving from Indo-PACOM to CENTCOM, and this is also something Israel is very heavily trying to encourage, then a very unique and potentially historic window opens for China with Taiwan. If US aircraft carriers, strategic bombers, and intelligence assets are all busy with Iran, then American forces could be significantly distracted and therefore weakened in Indo-Pacific when focusing on Taiwan. Usually the US likes to keep a couple aircraft carriers in the Indo-Pacific, but that number might be down to just one right now. Strategically, this is a very rare, possibly a once-in-a-generation type opportunity for China with Taiwan. Yes, the weather conditions within the Taiwan Strait are not exactly ideal, and a full-scale invasion of Taiwan would be enormously risky. But when else might China see such a significant US distraction? However, Beijing knows that this window is incredibly limited. After Iran is dealt with, China might find that US assets in the Pacific are going to be incredibly sticky, meaning that it's going to be very, very difficult for China to manipulate the movement of these forces and to get them out of the Pacific. Washington will not risk getting caught off guard twice, so China will have to weigh carefully, act now in imperfect conditions, or risk never again having such favorable odds. In short, you could argue China is a pretty complicated winner here. They gain a lot of economic leverage with Iran, they gain deeper cooperation with Russia, and they also gain some increased regional influence in the Middle East if they do choose to act on that. But they also are kind of getting a bit of a warning from the United States on the exact capabilities that the US has, and they're also losing an opportunity potentially if they don't act on Taiwan. Now let's talk about a couple less obvious losers in this conflict, countries whose positions might seem a little bit more secure, but in reality they are quietly slipping. First, of course, there's Qatar. Now, calling Qatar here a loser is a little bit more complicated because they've always played both sides fairly skillfully. Qatar has walked a diplomatic tightrope. They've maintained friendly relations with Iran and Saudi Arabia simultaneously. They've sheltered Hamas leaders within their borders, providing them safety and a place to operate from, but at the same time, they've also hosted a key US military base. But now with Iran's ability to provide funding and support drastically reduced, Qatar's position will shift significantly. They're more likely to pivot towards closer relations with Saudi Arabia, especially as Saudi-Israeli relations begin to normalize in the coming months and years. And here's my personal prediction: once this happens, Hamas leaders who currently reside in Qatar might find themselves asked to leave or outright expelled. And so Qatar is kind of losing here in that they can't exactly continue on with their current strategy, but they'll likely just shift more towards Saudi Arabia, and they'll be able to manage that pretty well in the future. Now, here's one that I think you may not expect, and this is just me forecasting a little bit. But Egypt. And I think this is going to sound a little bit kind of controversial because Egypt has stayed on the sidelines. They don't really have anything to do with this conflict with Iran, but I do think that they will be impacted by this. Here's the thing, though. Israel's war with Iran and the general Cold War with Iran for the past couple decades have kept their security forces in focus, heavily focused on the north, the east, and towards Gaza, but all away from Egypt. Quietly, though, Egypt has long been Hamas's most significant backer, facilitating supply routes and political support, and sometimes turning a blind eye to smuggling and funding networks into its own territory. Israel has tolerated this because Egypt poses a different kind of threat. It shares a direct border with Israel and has a very large conventional army, though it does not pursue nuclear weapons, so it's not exactly an existential threat to Israel, at least immediately. Now, with Iran significantly diminished and the northern front far more secure than it was before, Israel is likely to turn its security attention southward. Egypt may not be in immediate target, but the dynamic is going to undeniably change here. In the coming years, don't be surprised to see Israeli politicians either subtly or more overtly begin framing Egypt as the next significant regional adversary. No conflict with Egypt is imminent, I would argue. In fact, I think that if there is one that happens, it's a long way from now. But watch closely what Israel's dialogue and vernacular is with Egypt and what kind of strategic discussions and rhetoric begin with regard to Egypt. Overall, though, this war between Israel and Iran, while still short, is one of the most one-sided and consequential wars of this century. I'm also recording it before it's over, so a lot of things could change, but this is just me right now reacting to what we've seen so far, and we will see if some of my assumptions turn out to be valid or if new events happen and that completely alters my assessment. Okay, editor Caleb back. I'm recording this on the 19th. That is Thursday, the day before this video should be uploaded. So far, it looks like the United States is still considering the decision to enter itself into the war. They have not made the decision, at least as of the time of this recording. So most of the assessments that I believe in this video should stay, but I think the main question is going to be just exactly how much pain that Israel is going to have to weather before the regime collapses in Iran. So I don't necessarily think that it's a matter of if it's going to happen. I think it's a matter of when. But of course, like I said before, we'll just have to talk about this in a later video if anything dramatic happens. But still, at the same time, this war has been so one-sided that I don't even think that folks that aren't actively monitoring this situation really understand just how one-sided it's been. So situation monitors, leave a comment just how one-sided this has been. It has been a disaster for Iran. This is arguably the most one-sided affair since Kendrick's last Drake album. But with that, we'll continue to, like I said, monitor the situation. We'll see what happens, and if anything big happens that alters this assessment, I'll come back with a later video and revise whatever needs to be revised. But ultimately, it is clear that this war will reshape the Middle East, and it will be felt for months or even years. Saddam's downfall can still be felt in Iraq today. Gaddafi's downfall can still be felt in Libya today. Assad's downfall just happened, but that's also going to be felt for a very long time. This is a very huge deal. So with all that, comment your thoughts, comment what you think we'll be seeing next and what impact you think that this will have on the Middle East. Like this video if you found it helpful or interesting. Share it with a friend that also might like this video, and subscribe for more analysis just like this. Also, shout out to my patrons, Matt and Cameron. If you're interested in joining the Patreon, getting access to exclusive benefits, there's a link down in the description. For all that, I'll see you all next time.